Raymond Arroyo sitting in for the great Laura Ingraham. Delighted to be joined on the phone by Patrick J. Buchanan, syndicated columnist, former presidential candidate, and the Sage of McLean. Pat, thanks for being with us.
Good to talk with you, my friend.
Hey, I want to start with this back and forth you're hearing. One candidate questioning the sanity of the other, and Donald Trump now questioning the physical stamina and mental stamina of Hillary Clinton. Does this work?
Well, I don't know that it works if he's challenging the physical stamina of Hillary Clinton, but you do get these reports which pop up every so often on Drudge that she slips and falls and that she had a bad incident back in 2012, that she had to wear glasses and things like that. I think the question of Hillary's health is coming up, and she's probably going to have to release something on that. But as for the back and forth, I don't think so. My feeling has always been that the election's going to come down to whether or not Donald Trump can make himself acceptable to that American majority that simply does not want Hillary Clinton to be president of the United States.
You know, Pat Buchanan, people, of course, remember, or they should, that you were at the right hand of Richard Nixon during his run and the years of his administration. You are probably the person most versed and able to answer this. When I saw the way Trump was running his campaign, and you and I even talked about this, it seemed Nixon was the model. Someone who was coming out forcefully, he was calling things as he saw it. He summoned and awakened that silent majority. And then in the general, he tacked to the middle a little bit to attract independents and even working class Democrats. Why hasn't Donald Trump been able to make that crucial pivot during the general election, and is that a problem in your estimation?
Well, there's no question, but Nixon had a very unique problem in '68. We had Wallace running to the populist right, who was in control, really, of the Deep South, and you couldn't get that from him. And then you had Humphrey, who was really who had been a populist, but was a man of the center-left. So Nixon had to maneuver between the two of them and use Agnew to fight Wallace in the South. But Trump has had a golden opportunity, I think, around the time of his convention and right after, because an awful lot of people I talked to who had been skeptical of him were looking at him and saying, well, can the guy do it? They don't want Hillary. And I think that period in there of the last month or so has been pretty much a lost month for Donald Trump in terms of the perception of the public. A lot of people have looked toward him and then I think looked away, and the polls are very tough now, especially in these battleground states. I think he needs some kind of major event intervening which shakes up the board, if you will, almost turns over the tables. And so people will take a new look and say, wait a minute, we have to take a new look at this race, and then take that opportunity if it arrives.
Well, that's the question. Do the debates furnish him with the only opportunity to really change the math here? I'm worried most. I'll tell you, these national polls, I don't give any credence to. I don't care about the national polls. I mean, he's down, 9 points in one of these national polls. It is the battleground polls that are much more concerning, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, we can go into the blue wall, the 18 states and District of Columbia that have gone Democratic in all 6 of the last elections, and Hillary sort of starts out with them. And I don't know any of those she's losing, and now she's becoming very competitive in Ohio and Florida and Colorado and these other places to add to that basic total, which would be very, very difficult. But I do agree there's got to be some kind of event intervening, and events have intervened, whether it's the Vladimir Putin looking through his file of emails or WikiLeaks or whatever it is. Do they have something? And also it could be something abroad, some horrendous atrocity in the West or in the United States, something like that causes people to refocus. But the debates, I'll be honest, I think the debates are the place, but Hillary Clinton is I don't see her as being a great debater who's going to score points off him and win, but I do see her as someone who will sit there and go the distance, if you will, like one of these fighters who simply will not go out cold and will last the 15 rounds, and who will not panic and who will not say something that really steps in it the way Gerald Ford did, for example.
Right. Well,
So
you
I
saw
think
that with in her debates with Bernie Sanders. She would just stand there and sort of take it, and then she'd fire back at him. You know, she
exactly. She'd sit there and take this abuse and come back. And again, as a candidate, when you just started off, she to me there's a very grating voice, if you will. It's almost shrill, and the country I think just does not want her. But they've got to be given an acceptable and desirable alternative. And that's been Trump's job, and that's been Trump's problem since the convention. As I say, he turned around an enormous number of people in the primaries. When he started off, they were saying, "What is this? Is this the halftime show or something?" and then he won them with an enormous turnout and tremendous enthusiasm and fire and a tremendous base. But he hasn't been able to build on it so far.
Pat Buchanan, there is a wonderful piece, insightful, I mean by wonderful, not necessarily the prescription, but the data in it. There's a Politico article called Why Trumpism Will Outlast Donald Trump. And it talks about 65% of white Americans who are exercised about things like immigration and trade. And, these are folks in the Rust Belt. And that they're not going anywhere. This is a chunk of the Republican Party that whether Donald Trump is here or someone else, it must be addressed. And here in Washington, I'm hearing all sorts of people this week talking about, when Trump's gone. I mean, they've already basically given up on him, some of these people.
Well,
and that seems premature, A. But B, they're falling right into the old patterns that in many ways created the opportunity for Donald Trump to lead the party and take over.
Well, you're right. What Thomas Wolfe said, you can't go home again. Look, we cannot repeal 2016. What that showed is there's an enormous constituency out there that bleeds over from the Republican Party into the Independents and the Democrats, an enormous constituency that is concerned about the deindustrialization of the country, about the arresting of wages, about jobs going overseas, about the borders being wide open, about the cultural, ethnic, racial, religious changes taking place in America. It's enormously unsettled, and it's concerned about us going into all of these wars abroad, and he tapped into that. Now, you cannot go back to the neocon playbook and say, we're going to have a battle in the Black Sea with the Russians again, or open immigration, open borders is a good thing. It's not going away, and you can see some of these things, Raymond, clear and speak to them almost more clearly. You don't get politically incorrect. If you take a look at what is happening in Europe, to the countries of Europe and the European Union and the rise of right-wing and populist parties across Europe, they're reacting to things that are happening. They're reacting to reality. And to fall back into the old Republican playbook for a Cold War that no longer exists and for times that no longer exist, I think they're going to attempt it. I read one of these conservative columnists and saying, when Trump's gone, the rebuilding must begin.
Right.
You mean we're going to try to take the country back to that? You can't.
No.
The country is moving forward.
Right. There's a piece, Bill McGurn in the Wall Street Journal. He says, he quotes a writer who says, who is this? A National Review article that says Trump's voters are stupid whites who are embittered because they're losing out in the global economy. But Bill McGurn writes, a new Gallup paper suggests this may be a caricature that misses the fuller picture. The analysis by Gallup senior economist Jonathan Rothwell, who looked not only at Trump voters but where they lived, found the results showed mixed evidence that economic distress has motivated Trump supporters. Some of them are less educated and more likely to work blue-collar jobs, but they earn relatively high household incomes, and they're living in areas that are exposed to trade and immigration, and that does not increase Trump's support necessarily. So it's showing that, in fact, in areas where people were more affected by immigration and competition from Chinese imports, support for Trump declined. So that may not be motivating them in isolation, Pat.
No, I do think cultural changes and ethnic changes, and the phrase you always hear, and this isn't the country we grew up in. And I talk to some African American folks and they say, no, it's not. We've come forward, and you do have civil rights laws and things like that. but you've also got the enormous problems, for example, attendant to the educational system, which is not working. You've got illegitimacy, you've got crime, you've got drugs, you've got a toxic culture and the rest of it that affects both communities and the whole country. And I think this reaction, this resistance and recoil is, to me, in a way, it's, someone wrote, I almost forget the phraseology. He said, yeah, I am a reactionary because only a corpse does not react to the maggots crawling upon it. And it was a pretty paleo statement.
Yeah, I'll say.
But it has a ring of truth to it, and people are reacting. They're not reacting against the civil rights laws of the 1960s, but they do wonder what is going on in Milwaukee. Mm-hmm. What is happening when someone was shot, okay. It was an African-American fellow at 24 years old. He had a gun with 23 bullets in it, which is probably illicit. And he was shot in a shootout with an African-American policeman, and all of a sudden a small part of Milwaukee is burned down. Mm. And so I think that people look at this and they say, what is going on in this country? I remember those days, Raymond, probably before you were born, sure. In Detroit and Newark and Watts and D.C. after Martin Luther King was shot and 100 cities burning up. But are we going back to that again?
Yeah. I want to play something for you, Pat. This was Donald Trump trying to reclaim the message and advance his own candidacy. Yesterday, he gave a much-touted foreign policy speech. At the heart of it was this message for screening immigrants and their ideology.
In the Cold War, we had an ideological screening test. The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today.
And he calls it extreme vetting, Pat. Does that help? Does that break through and win him support?
Well, I think whatever he's gotten from his tough statement, no more Muslims are coming into the country, the net downside of that and the upside of that he's already gotten. I'm not sure this changes that formula right now doing that, but it's quite clear that does send a message that Trump is deeply concerned about people coming into this country, where they're coming from, what they believe, and that he is deeply alarmed by what you find out happened in Brussels and Paris and San Bernardino and places like that from folks who came in here to kill us. So I think he does send that particular message. But I think really the immigration system of the United States, legal and illegal, a whole thing alike, I think that if someone addressed that entire issue, I remember back in 92, we said, look, right now we got, illegals pouring across the borders and folks coming in, we overstayed visas and the rest of it. And why don't we have a moratorium on immigration in the sense that 250,000 come each year, mm-hmm. but we're going to see what is happening to society and all the rest of it. Take a time out, a pause, and I think the country would have responded well to it. Look, there's no right of folks abroad to come here, live here, and become citizens.
Mm-hmm. Pat, I want to talk about these polls for a minute that we keep seeing, and it has, I think, it's spread discouragement through some parts of the Republican Party, and as you talk to people, they're kind of hanging their heads. Here's my question: when you look at his rallies, Trump's rallies, he's pulling in 5-1 more people than Hillary Clinton. Is that indicative of anything? And might the polls, as they did during the primary, not be telling the whole story? I know there are a lot of people. Look, I was traveling from the West Coast the other day, and there were people who were talking amongst themselves in the row in front of me. And one guy reluctantly, after about a half hour of conversation, admitted that he and his wife and his whole family were supporting Donald Trump. And, of course, one of the other people jumped him for it. But there is that kind of shyness because of the media drumbeat to admit who you support here. Are the polls indicative and reflective of where the people actually are?
If the polls showed the two of them at the end of the race dead even, I would say Trump will win for the very reason you mentioned. Mm-hmm. It is politically incorrect and even worse than that in many communities to say you're for Donald Trump because automatically, comes the cries racist, xenophobe, and all the rest of it. And I think that's true. Secondly, you are correct in terms of the The crowds indicate enthusiasm, desire for change, the intensity of support for Donald Trump. The truth is that Hillary Clinton is a bore. She's I mean, in terms of we've seen her all too many times for too long, gone through too many of these episodes with her. She's not an exciting candidate. And so I think, this is why I wrote the column. When you see what happened in the country, Bernie's got tremendous crowds as well, almost as big as Trump. Trump got great crowds. Cruz was not a beloved figure in D.C., and people gave him tremendous support. All of these folks basically were running to change the government in Washington dramatically and radically, and they were the ones that got out the crowds. They were the ones that got the votes. And if at the end of this we've got Hillary Rodham Clinton with Bubba up there holding the Bible, it's you're going to have a very disillusioned country.
Pat Buchanan, insightful as always. Thanks so much for the time, and we will see you soon. Pat Buchanan's columns, of course, online, and he's always so prescient. Thank you, Pat.